Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third episode of the spring semester of the series Art Up Close at the BCMA. Happy Wednesday. My name is Claire Traum. I'm a senior and I'm majoring in art history and minoring in economics. And I'm also one of the student representatives for the Bowdoin Museum Advisory Council.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Lucy Siegel. I'm a junior here at Bowdoin. I'm double majoring in art history and government, and I am also a student representative to the Museum Advisory Council.
Great. So for those of you who are new to Art Up Close, our webinar series is aimed at connecting students with specific works of art in the Bowdoin Museum. Each episode features a bite-sized presentation led by a Bowdoin student, an art history professor, or a museum staff member. So we're so excited you're here with us today. We hope that you learned something new, and we definitely encourage you to ask questions in the chat after Professor Fletcher's presentation. Also note that all 7 of our previous webinars are posted on Bowdoin's YouTube channel. So we will drop that link in the chat so you can check them out.
Awesome. So today we are so excited to welcome Pamela Fletcher to discuss William Henry Hunt's Fungi. Professor Fletcher is the author of Narrating Modernity, the British Problem Picture, and co-editor of The Rise of the Modern Art Market in London. And she is currently writing a history of Victorian modern life painting, portions of which have already been published in multiple journals. Professor Fletcher also graduated from Bowdoin and is now professor of art history here at the college. She was a founding co-director of the Digital and Computational Studies Initiative at Bowdoin and is the chair of the art history department. I personally have taken several courses with Professor Fletcher, including contemporary art, women, gender, and sexuality in Western European and American art, and realism and its discontents in European art. What about you, Claire?
Yes, I've had Professor Fletcher for modern art, her commercial art gallery seminar, and I had the privilege of working with her last semester on my independent study on California artists. So she's a wonderful and beloved professor at Bowdoin. We're thrilled she's here presenting at Art Up Close. She can share some of her 19th century British art expertise with us. We encourage our virtual audience to engage with Professor Fletcher and ask any questions you can think of. We will moderate questions after her presentation, and closed captioning is available in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. So with that, Professor Fletcher, you may take it away.
Thank you, Lucy and Claire, for that lovely introduction, and thank all 3 of you for the invitation to be part of this series. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen now. Right. This is William Henry Hunt's watercolor and gouache fungi. It's one of my favorite things in the collection, and I'm delighted to share it with you today and look at it up close via this digital medium. I'm going to aim to speak for about 10 minutes, so to discipline myself, I've divided the presentation into 4 discrete and hopefully succinct points about the work, rather than stitching them together into a more formal talk. 1. Seeing fungi. This is a small watercolor and gouache, which is a kind of water-soluble paint, but one with added white pigment so it doesn't sink into the paper like watercolor does. You can see that Hunt uses it for highlights, and so you can see it in areas here, these white stipples that he puts across the surface, and they sit on top. They're thicker than the watercolor paint. He also painted on top of an opaque white ground, which brightens the image, a technique which would influence the Pre-Raphaelites. William Henry Hunt was a British artist who lived from 1790 to 1864, and you see his self-portrait in later years on the left. He specialized in watercolor, which was not uncommon in 19th century Britain. There were, in fact, 2 professional organizations entirely devoted to watercolor painters, with annual exhibitions and professional memberships. And I believe I found evidence that Hunt exhibited fungi at the 1858 Old Watercolor Society exhibition. He primarily painted figure studies and small plant studies, such as primrose and bird's nest at the Tate, which you see on the right. And indeed, he would become known as Bird's Nest Hunt because that was one of his favorite subjects. The focus on the close observation of the natural world that we see in Hunt's watercolor was characteristic of 19th century British painting more generally, with the foremost art critic of the day, John Ruskin, who you see here in a portrait by John Everett Millais, famously advising artists to, quote, Go to nature in all singleness of heart, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing. A phrase you may have heard used in relation to the pre-Raphaelite artists like Millet, whose Ophelia you see here, who took their canvases outside and painted the natural world in meticulous detail. Indeed, the title of my talk, We Never See Anything Clearly, is taken from Ruskin, who was keenly aware of how the conventions of artistic practice, the rush of everyday life, and our own assumptions about how things should be or look prevented us from seeing the world around us honestly. Ruskin was a great fan of Hunt's and even took some lessons from him. When you look closely at this small object, you can see how carefully Hunt is observing and depicting this small patch of ground. The vibrant, nearly fluorescent red fungi, the soft mosses in shades of green that surround it, and the finely veined leaves with mottled patches of purple, green, and yellow that have fallen onto them. I encourage you all to see it in person when you can, as the closer you look, the more detail you see in this tiny little world. 2, framing seeing. One of the most unusual things about this watercolor and others of Hunt's is the decision to shape the picture as an oval. He's not alone in this practice of using a shaped canvas. There was somewhat of a fashion for shaping pictures in this way in the 1850s. Pre-Raphaelite examples like the Awakening Conscience, which you see on the left, are the most well known. But the practice was more widely spread in the decade, as you can see in this oddly shaped painting by William Maw Egley, Omnibus Life in London, or in closer comparison to the Hunt, Ford Madox Brown's An English Afternoon. And I'll just note here the oddity of my images, but I'll say that museums don't often make public representations of pictures in their frames. They usually take them out of their frames. So you see the Brown out of its frame to see the image itself. And then this was the only image I could find, a kind of social media image of a guy taking a picture of it, to actually show it framed. Now, the gold frame, and I bothered to show you that not terrific picture, the gold frame's a critical part of how these shaped images work. So it's a little hard to get the full effect when you see the watercolor on the full sheet of paper, which is how I've been showing it to you, or matted as the museum has it presented, where the matte opening is also an oval, but leaves space around the painted area so you can see the edges. I think it would originally have been framed like this Hunt's bird's nest at the Frick in Pittsburgh, with a gold frame coming right up over the edges. So as an experiment, here's a version with fungi photoshopped into the Frick frame. When you compare the two, you can see how the frame changes your view, focusing your attention on the mushroom, the leaf, and the moss with a microscopic precision. I've gotten interested in this Victorian experimentation with framing shapes recently, and I'm working on an article about it. And one idea I'm exploring is that it's a reference to, among other things, new optical devices and technologies of vision, including the camera, the stereograph, and newly powerful microscopes, as well as other forms of modern framing devices coming into use in the 19th century, such as the theatrical proscenium arch. All of these devices are about framing vision, making you very aware that you're looking closely and directedly, a concern that seems to be shared by painters at mid-century. 3, seeing fungi at Bowdoin. So how did fungi come to be in the Bowdoin collection? It entered the collection in 1956, the gift of Susan Dwight Bliss. Bliss was the only daughter of Jeanette Bliss and the wealthy banker businessman George Bliss. She was an art collector and philanthropist who worked on social welfare causes. In the little I've been able to find out about her, it seems she never married and was close friends with a circle of women, including Sarah and Eleanor Hewitt, founders of the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York. Her name might be familiar to you, though, as she also gave us the interior of the library from her family home on East 68th Street in Manhattan, which was reassembled inside Hubbard and called the Susan Dwight Bliss Room. She also gave Bowdoin a treasure trove of books and works of art, nearly 1,000 prints, and a music room in Gibson. I often wish I could have met her, as very often when I ask to see a drawing or a beautiful Victorian illustrated book, I find she's the one who chose it. And someday I think it would be great if a student wanted to work on a project about her and her collection. We don't know why she chose Bowdoin for this generous gift, though we do know she had a summer house in Bar Harbor and visited campus on her travels to and from New York. Fourth, and finally, the ethics of seeing clearly. For Ruskin, seeing clearly isn't primarily about art or even about science, though he's interested in both those things. For him, seeing nature clearly is a moral imperative. Remember, the mid-19th century is the height of the Industrial Revolution. Disease is rampaging through cities, cholera primarily, and there are quarantines and outbreaks all over Europe. The effects of the pollution from coal smoke that powered factories and railways is becoming increasingly apparent. And in 1858, the same year Fungi was made, the River Thames that runs through London was so filled with human waste and industrial wastewater from poor sewage and sanitation and the lack of any environmental regulation that Parliament, which sits on the banks of the Thames, was unable to meet, an environmental catastrophe dubbed the Great Stink of 1858. And you're seeing here two political images from Punch magazine in those years about the dangers that the polluted river poses. Victorians, or some of them, knew that things were badly out of kilter with humans' relationship to the environment. And we need to see works like Fungi very much in that context, where looking closely at nature is not an act of nostalgia, but an act of survival. There's much more to say, but I'm going to give the always eloquent Ruskin the last word. He wrote, and I believe he's speaking about Bowdoin's picture specifically, quote, "And thus lastly to these scarlet, no, not scarlet, nor crimson, nor in any ways speakably colored fungi, for which with a serious heart I thank the painter, and with more thanks than I can give for any other picture here, as having best shown us the gracious splendor which there is in the meanest herb of the field." Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. You are welcome to add questions to the Q&A or chat, and we can moderate. But just to get us started, I think we're curious if students have worked on this piece in particular, and if you could share a little bit more about that process.
Sure. So in, I think, 2012, I taught a seminar on the pre-Raphaelites, and it was, I was coming back from sabbatical, and it was a very specific topic, and I ended up with only 2 students enrolled for the course. So I went to the museum and I said, gosh, what can we do? This can't be a regular seminar. And working with Joachim, who was the curator at the time, we came up with the idea of really exploring the collection and seeing if the students could curate a small exhibition in Becker. And so as we were going through pre-Raphaelites and the collection sort of broadly defined, the students, Ursula and Ben, really honed in on this work. And then it became kind of the door that opened up looking at the many pre-Raphaelite works, both British and American, that are in the museum collection. And that's actually the time when I did the research that uncovered the material about Ruskin reviewing what I think is this specific work of art. And then that led us actually to date the work, which hadn't been dated in the museum's collection up to that point. And the show was beautiful, and very unusually, it actually got a write-up in, I think, the Portland Press Herald by the art critic who had come up to see a different show. And he started the review by saying he normally didn't review student exhibitions, but that this one was such a gem of a show that he just couldn't help himself. So that was a super fun experience, and the beginning of my real appreciation for this object and for Susan Dwight Bliss.
How interesting. Thank you for sharing. And a related question is, how often is this picture displayed in the museum?
The museum with staff would know that better than I would, but I would say not that often, because it's a watercolor, and so it is a little fugitive and precious. So it's not like an oil painting, which can be out all of the time. So I don't think it's on view all that often, but I know that you can make appointments, hopefully at some point, to see works. And this is one that really repays seeing in person. When Sean and I had it out, in the storeroom a couple weeks ago, we noticed a super interesting thing about it, which is that actually, if you move yourself off to one side of it and look at it from an angle, the perspective of those red fungi really snaps, and they really have a much more three-dimensional presence. And to that, I would note that the one that I saw a couple years ago at the Frick, the bird's nest one, an interesting thing about that is not only do I think that's the original frame, they hang that one at something like knee height. It's actually hung low on a chain that drops down from a chair rail. And so that's why my picture of it is so crooked. I couldn't really get a straight on picture of it. But also I think it's placing it in a space that would come closer to mimicking the perspective you have on it and put it at that angle where the three-dimensionality of it popped. I mean, I can't imagine Anne and Frank are going to want to hang it way down at knee level, but it would be an interesting experiment.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting, just thinking about the future of museum and museum spaces. It'll be interesting to see if there's ever a reason to do that experiment. So we have another question about your case that you made that the oval format of the painting reflected optical devices. And so the question is, was the artist himself using them in creating this work, or others, like using the optical devices?
So that's an excellent question. And I would say that I don't know the specific answer, but that certainly in the mid-19th century, the worlds of art and science, and photography would have been considered a science at that point, were very intimately linked, and even in terms of geography. So the home of the Royal Academy of Painting was actually housed in the same building eventually that many of the scientific societies of the time were housed in, and certainly the Pre-Raphaelites, Ruskin, who was part of Hunt's circle, were very interested in photography in particular, and very interested in what photography could and could not reveal in terms of detail. And I think one of the things that's interesting, and one of the things that Ruskin is emphasizing so much, he's emphasizing the color. And of course, color is a thing that photography can't do at that moment. So there's a sense in which it's both reflecting, I think, yes, there are these new tools like cameras and other things, but there are things that painting can do that at that moment technology cannot. But whether or not he's specifically using things like microscopes or photography in his artistic practice, I don't know the answer to that, but it's possible.
Yeah, thank you. I actually had I had a question about the photography relationship, and I know we also have an audience question. Hopefully this might lead into that to that question, but I'm wondering about the relationship between naturalism and the emphasis on naturalism and the rise of photography. And I understand how there could be a little bit of reaction for artists to do what photography can't, but would you say naturalism itself was very much a reaction to emphasize what artists couldn't, or it was just part of the Romantic era, kind of separate?
So I guess what I would say is that I think that technological change and artistic change arise out of the same cultural matrix. And so I think, one thing we know about photography is that some of the ways that you could make the technologies of photography weren't things that people didn't know. They just didn't put them all together until, that moment in the late 1830s, early 1840s. And I think that it's a response, that interest in photographic reproduction, to the same forces that drive artists to be interested in more detailed, naturalistic representations of the world around them. And it has to do with science. It has to do with cultural history. It has to do with changes in sort of journalism and newspapers and how people are getting news about the real world in their lives. So I think it's a really complicated interplay. And I would say that at the base level, the impulse to photography and the impulse to naturalism in art come from the same place. But as your question suggests, they do then sort of become, there is a kind of cultural tussle about which medium can do better. And it takes a while. I mean, photography in the beginning is not really that detailed, except for daguerreotypes, which are one-off. So it takes a while for painting to feel like threatened by photography, I would say, although that does ultimately pop up in some accounts.
Interesting. Thank you. We have another comment from the audience. Great talk about a wonderful watercolor. Would you characterize Hunt as a proto-environmentalist?
It's an area that is something that I'm just starting to really think about. I would characterize Ruskin for sure as a proto-environmentalist, and in some senses, maybe not even proto. I mean, there are ways in which there are very self-conscious critiques that don't go by the name environmentalism, but that we would recognize as being those concerns. Hunt himself is of a slightly older generation. And I will say, despite the fact that I think he's quite talented and quite interesting, the fact that his nickname at the time was Bird's Nest Hunt, I think gives you some sense of the peripheral way that people saw his art as like very pretty, but sort of decorative. So I think it's a new approach to looking at his work and really taking it seriously in those terms. And so I think in his actions and his vision, he is. In terms of his politics or other kinds of things he might have said, I don't know that we know enough about him to say that.
Thanks for sharing that perspective. Wonderful. Well, we don't have more questions now. I think that this was a wonderful talk, a very interesting discussion. We're so grateful that you're willing to partake in this episode. So with that, I think we will wrap up, unless Lucy, do you want to share anything else or have different thoughts?
I actually do have one more question. I think this is very interesting. This is kind of a question a little bit out of left field. I'm just like thinking about it. So if there's no answer, no worries. But just thinking about like naturalism again, and also that specifically this piece, it feels feminine in a lot of ways. I think it's potentially like the subject matter, or just like even the color palette feels very feminine. So would you say naturalism was gendered in any way? Was this scene, or am I just like still thinking in like contemporary gender roles of like flowers and more floral things being considered feminine? Or was at this time this like rise of naturalism, was that like a manly pursuit? I don't know. I'm asking, I guess, like about how gendered these like subject matters were.
So I would say, I think what you're, to the extent that there's a way that gender intersects, it's not necessarily in terms of style, I would say, but there is a tradition in which flower painting is gendered feminine, right? So like the first women who were admitted to the Royal Academy as professional artists, one of them, Mary Moser, is a flower painter. So there is a kind of tradition of gendering the genre of flower painting. What I think is sort of interesting is, I think part of the oval framing and that sort of looking down perspective, I think that's part of Hunt's attempt to put the work into a different category than flower painting, which may be a gendered move, right? To say, no, this is more serious. And if you notice, he cuts off any sense, like flower painting as done by women usually has a vase, it's in some sort of domestic interior. So the other thing his focus does is put you outdoors, I think, in terms of how you're understanding this. Now, it's possible that it's like a terrarium or something, but I think it's meant to suggest that you're like tramping out of doors and seeing this. So I think he's evoking sort of the scientist, naturalist view of nature rather than nature brought indoors and composed. That is the more feminine sort of flower painting. Watercolor is also an axis of gender here, though, and watercolor is simultaneously a sort of accomplishment for upper middle class and aristocratic women. So if you learn to draw, you learn how to draw and paint in watercolor. It's an achievement. And so it's gendered in those terms. But the professional societies that grow up, two professional societies of watercolor painters in London at this period of time, are also really making a case for it as a profession, which in this period is gendered male. So I think that there are ways in which watercolor painters and painters like Hunt who do plant studies are trying to fend off those gendered associations. So gender is present in that way. But I think they're couching their work, and Ruskin is too, in a very sort of masculine, scientific, naturalist mode. So that was a good question, Lucy.
Thank you. Yeah, that was fascinating. I'm still thinking about our course from last semester, but I think unless anybody else has any questions they want to throw in the chat, thank you so much for
thank you,
professor this semester. Claire, if you have anything else, we can hand it over to Professor Fletcher before we end the call.
No, just echoing that thanks. And thank you for all who joined us today. It's great to see you.
Yes, thanks everyone. And go and see the picture at the museum when you can. It's really, really worth a visit.
Wonderful.
Thank
Okay,
you.
have a great rest of the day.
All right, bye.
Bye.